First, let's cover how technique influences strength. The technique we use can have a large impact on how much load we are able to lift. When it comes to strength, the goal is obviously to lift the most weight possible. So the technique we use should be the one which allows us to lift the most weight. For example, if we were to squat with a low bar powerlifting style, we can usually lift more weight than squatting with a high bar upright full depth style squat. However, this is also constrained to some extent by the rules and regulations of the federation you are following, or whatever rules you impose on yourself to count as a valid lift. At a high level, each strength sport and their associated federations have specific criteria which determine what is valid technique and what is not. For example, according to the International Powerlifting Federation, a valid bench press is considered one where the bar touches the chest, it must be paused in that position until a press command is given, pressed until the elbows are fully straightened, feet must be flat on the ground, and buttocks must stay in contact with the bench. In CrossFit, kipping pull-ups are often used to achieve the most reps, as they are permitted in the rules and are more efficient than performing strict pull-ups. But if you are just training for general strength with no plans to compete in strength sport, then you can pretty much determine whatever technique constraints you like. In any case, we essentially just want to use the most biomechanically efficient technique. This will allow us to either lift the heaviest weight for a given number of reps, or perform the most reps at a submaximal weight. It should be noted, however, that this technique is recommended only for competition lifts. For accessory lifts or other lifts where we aren't concerned about performance, we may want to use a different technique for reasons we will soon discuss. For example, we may bench press with the technique that allows the heaviest loads to be used, if that is a lift we want to get stronger at. However, if we are performing tricep pushdowns for the purposes of growing our triceps so that it can help contribute to the bench press, then it isn't recommended to take the same approach of using the technique which allows the heaviest loads. While the technique recommended for strength is fairly straightforward, it becomes a little more complicated for the purposes of hypertrophy training. This is because the goal for hypertrophy training is not to lift the most weight like it is for strength. For hypertrophy training, we are essentially trying to induce the greatest muscle stress. It is this local muscular stress which causes muscle growth as an adaptation to training. But the question is, does the technique we lift with actually matter for muscle growth? There are a few different technique variables that we will discuss. The first is range of motion. In general, training through a larger range of motion usually results in slightly superior muscle growth. This was seen in this meta-analysis, which found that training with a larger range of motion tends to produce more muscle growth on average compared with partial range of motion training. The reason for this is likely due to the fact that range of motion influences how much a muscle lengthens during an exercise. Training with a larger range of motion typically means that a muscle is being lengthened to a greater extent. As a simple example, going lower down during bicep curls takes the biceps into a more lengthened position compared with only going partway down. And training a muscle through a more lengthened position tends to result in slightly superior growth compared with training through shorter muscle lengths. This is evident when we compare partial range of motion training at different muscle lengths. For example, this study compared the effects of performing leg extensions with either partial range of motion in the lengthened position, partial range of motion in the shortened position, full range of motion, or alternating between the lengthened and shortened partial ranges. It was found that all groups including the lengthened range of the exercise saw similar increases in quadriceps cross-sectional area, with only the shortened partials seeing slightly inferior growth. So essentially, it seems that training with a range of motion which includes training the target muscle in the most lengthened position is most important for muscle growth when it comes to range of motion. This can be achieved by training with a full range of motion or by performing partial range of motion reps in the most stretched position. Furthermore, it may be beneficial to use lengthened partial reps as a way to extend a set past what is traditionally considered failure. For some exercises, we are able to perform a few extra partial reps in the lengthened range even after we have reached failure using a full range of motion. And this may result in slightly superior muscle growth compared with regular full range of motion training. For example, this study compared the effects of performing calf raises to failure with either a full range of motion with one leg or continuing a set using partial range of motion after full range failure has been reached with the other leg. It was found that significant increases in gastrocnemius muscle thickness were seen in both legs, but the extended partial reps resulted in slightly superior growth. The next technique variable we will discuss is tempo. There are 3 individual phases of tempo that can be manipulated: the concentric or lifting phase, the eccentric or lowering phase, and potentially the use of isometrics, or pausing reps in certain positions. Overall, when training with any combination of tempos at different phases, significant muscle growth is able to be achieved, so long as we are training close to failure. However, are there specific rep cadences which are able to maximize muscle growth? First, let's discuss the impact of concentric tempo on hypertrophy. Well, concentric rep speed is kind of redundant when training close to failure with traditional weight training. This is because regardless of how fast you try to lift, eventually it will slow down as we approach failure during a set until we can no longer lift the weight up. So we can somewhat control the concentric tempo for the first few reps of a set, but we can't control rep speed the closer to failure we get. However, eccentric tempo can be intentionally manipulated throughout the entire set. We are always stronger eccentrically than we are concentrically. So even once we reach concentric failure, we are still able to lower the weight under control. So the question is, does the specific eccentric tempo we train with actually matter for muscle growth? And if so, what tempo is best? Well, we don't have much evidence looking at this, and the evidence we do have isn't all that conclusive. But overall, there seems to be a slight trend favoring slower and more controlled eccentric tempos. For example, this study compared the effects of performing preacher curls with either a 1 or 4 second eccentric tempo. It was found that biceps cross-sectional area increased to a greater magnitude after training with a 4 second eccentric tempo compared with 1 second eccentrics. Furthermore, this study compared the effects of performing leg extensions with 2 second eccentrics on one leg and 4 second eccentrics on the other leg. It was found that the quadriceps experienced significant muscle growth on both legs, with the slower eccentrics resulting in marginally superior overall gains. Another study compared the effects of performing squats with either a 1 or 4 second eccentric tempo. It was found that quadriceps cross-sectional area increased to a similar overall magnitude, with marginally superior gains observed with the slower eccentrics. So overall, it seems that great muscle growth can be achieved regardless of the specific eccentric tempo, provided we are training close to failure. There may be a small advantage to intentionally slowing down the eccentric a little bit, but this is unlikely to have any major impact. And lastly, let's discuss the use of isometrics. The effects of isometric tempo on muscle growth is something we don't really have any direct evidence for. However, a case could be made to implement pauses at some points during a repetition to maximize muscle growth. Hypothetically, it may be beneficial to pause reps in the stretched position to accumulate more time under tension at longer muscle lengths. Based on the evidence suggesting that training in a more lengthened position seems to be particularly effective for muscle growth, this could be a strategy to experiment with. Although, even if there is a benefit in doing so, the magnitude of effect would likely be very small. And the other primary technique variable is strictness. This refers to how much additional movement we implement from other muscles and joints which aren't the direct target of that exercise. For example, performing rows with more movement from the hips would be considered less strict than only allowing movement to occur at the shoulders and arms. But how much of an impact on muscle growth does strictness really have? Well, as far as I am aware, we only have one study which has directly looked at this. This study compared the effects of performing bicep curls and tricep pushdowns using either strict form or allowing external momentum to lift the weight. It was found that overall biceps and triceps muscle thickness increased to a similar magnitude in both conditions. So it is difficult to say with confidence how strictness influences muscle growth. But overall, as long as we are training close to failure and the target muscle is what limits performance of the set, the overall hypertrophic stimulus will probably be similar. In some cases, it could be argued that a little movement from other joints could be somewhat beneficial. For example, performing a seated cable row allowing some forward lean would take the lats into a more stretched position, which could hypothetically result in a little more growth. And in other cases, it could be argued that being stricter is more favorable. For example, excessive movement from the hips during many abdominal exercises may primarily train the hip flexors rather than the ab muscles which we are trying to target. And the last technique consideration for muscle growth is for the potential to bias certain muscles over others. It is sometimes advised to train with specific techniques in order to maximize the hypertrophic stimulus of a particular muscle or region of a muscle over others. For example, all squat variations will primarily train the quadriceps and glutes. However, it is sometimes advised to lean more forward to bias the glutes and keep an upright torso to bias the quads. But how much of a difference in muscle growth does this actually make? Well, unfortunately, the evidence is very limited on this topic, which makes it difficult to make confident conclusions. The only somewhat relevant study I am aware of compared the effects of performing calf raises with either the feet pointed outward, inward, or forward. It was found that pointing the feet out resulted in greater medial gastrocnemius thickness, while pointing the feet inward resulted in greater lateral gastroc thickness, with roughly equal gains seen when the feet were pointed forward. This study provides some indication that technique can be adjusted to bias certain muscles or regions of a muscle. However, this can't really be extrapolated to all muscles and exercises. Although at this stage we can just use our knowledge of muscle anatomy to potentially bias certain muscles or regions. For example, performing a row by pulling lower towards the hip and flexing the spine would hypothetically bias the lats a little more by emphasizing shoulder extension. Whereas pulling higher with a more flared elbow position and extending the spine would hypothetically bias the mid-back region by emphasizing shoulder horizontal extension. I think it is certainly worth experimenting with different techniques to try and intentionally bias the muscles you want to emphasize during an exercise. However, at this stage, the magnitude in terms of how much muscle growth difference this would make isn't entirely clear. So overall, it seems that lifting technique may have a small influence on muscle growth. Although when training close to failure, there doesn't seem to be a major magnitude of difference when comparing different lifting technique strategies. Now that we have discussed the influence of technique on strength and hypertrophy, the other element to address is fatigue. Technique can influence the amount of fatigue induced via resistance training. This is primarily due to how technique influences the amount of weight we are able to lift. Generally, training with a more mechanically efficient technique, less range of motion, a faster tempo, and more external momentum allows us to lift heavier loads. While less mechanically efficient technique, more range of motion, a slower tempo, and using less momentum limits how much weight we can lift. For example, this study compared the effects of performing partial versus full range of motion squats. And as expected, the partial range group used heavier average loads compared with the full range group. However, the deep squats produced slightly greater overall increases in lower body muscle cross-sectional area despite using lighter loads. And when training with heavier loads, the fatigue we induce is typically going to be higher in three primary ways. For one, joint stress will be greater. This can increase our risk of developing joint or connective tissue pain or irritation. Second is that lifting heavier loads will usually be a little more taxing on the cardiorespiratory system. This can increase our perceived effort and may prevent us from training as close to failure as we otherwise would have. And third, because of the greater cardiorespiratory and psychological fatigue, lifting heavier loads generally requires longer rest periods to recover. While this isn't directly an issue, it can potentially limit the total number of sets we are able to complete within a certain time frame. So for the purposes of muscle growth, if the hypertrophic stimulus is going to be equal or slightly superior, I would opt for the technique which limits excessive fatigue. This doesn't mean we need to be overly fearful of fatigue, it just means that we should avoid lifting in a way that contributes to excessively more fatigue than needs to without benefiting muscle growth. However, when it comes to strength, extra fatigue is just part of the game. We still want to train with the technique which allows us to lift the most weight, even if it comes at the expense of greater fatigue. Taking all this into consideration, does technique really matter for your lifting goals? Well, for strength, it certainly does matter. You want to perform competition lifts with the technique that allows you to lift the most weight or perform the most submaximal reps. It is also important that this abides by the rules and regulations of what is considered a legal lift. In terms of hypertrophy, there seems to be less of an influence for technique on muscle growth. As long as we train close to failure, lifting with basically any technique seems to produce great muscle growth. However, there may be some small advantages to training with a full range of motion, controlling the eccentric tempo, and possibly adjusting technique to bias certain muscles or regions. The technique we train with can also influence fatigue. This is because technique can influence how much load is used for a given exercise. When training with heavier loads, we generally induce greater joint stress, cardiorespiratory fatigue, and require longer rest periods. So for hypertrophy training, we may want to avoid inducing extra unnecessary fatigue via certain techniques if it doesn't contribute to greater muscle growth. But for strength, the extra fatigue is part of the process since we want to train with the heaviest loads possible. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.